movement against Israel. That's all. There is no effort really to impose academic sanctions, boycotts against any other country in the world. It is solely directed against the nation state of the Jewish people and has to be so understood. So the question, is it just a royal pain in the neck for Israel, or does it pose a real strategic threat? And the answer, as usual to most questions on this terrific conference, is somewhere in between. It's never the extremes as posed in the questions. And I think one has to make three divisions that I want to talk about. One is BDS as a symptom rather than as an effect. And the second is BDS in terms of its short-term versus its long-term implications. And third is BDS effects on Israel as distinguished from its effects on the rest of the world and the peace process. So let's start first of all with BDS as a symptom as distinguished from an effect. It clearly is a symptom of a deep, deep problem that is affecting Israel and affecting the world. There is absolutely no question that if one thinks about the trajectory of Israel's perception among the world over the past 50 years, 30 years, 20 years, and 10 years, there's been a dramatic, dramatic change. When I was growing up, when I was a university student, everybody loved Israel. Certainly the lay people in Europe, certainly the left. People came from Denmark and from Sweden and from Holland to work in the kibbutzim, whether they came out of a feeling of guilt for what their parents did or didn't do during the Holocaust, or out of deep, real feelings toward Israel. There was a deep, abiding love for Israel among the average common person. The interesting thing was that was coupled with a disdain for Israel among the elites. The State Department in the United States, the foreign ministries of many foreign countries, the economic elites had nothing but contempt for Israel. Israel was making it more expensive to buy oil. Israel was creating problems in the Middle East in terms of those people who supported connections between European countries and Arabs. And so we had an elite disdain for Israel coupled with grassroots popular support. Today we've seen that flip somewhat. Because of Israel's great success as a startup nation, because of Israel's great economic success at a time when the world was suffering from tremendous economic problems, in light of Israel's military successes, intelligence successes, we're seeing a dramatic change. Israel is now, in many ways, very much approved of by the economic elite, by the political elite, even foreign ministries and state departments, though they haven't changed completely, are more supportive of Israel. Certainly the military establishments in Europe and in the United States and other countries are have greater respect for Israel. But at the same time that that's happening, the very same children of those who came to the kibbutzim and who supported Israel are regarding Israel as a pariah nation. Just look at a poll that took place in Europe at the beginning of this year, where Europeans were asked what country in the world posed the greatest threat to peace, and the greatest number of answers were that Israel was that #1 nation that posed the greatest threat to peace. Not North Korea, not Iran, not Iraq, not Syria, not any of the other countries that pose real threats to peace in the world, but Israel, a country that has been trying to achieve peace since its establishment. Or if you look at polls taken by Amnesty International, by Human Rights Watch, listing the greatest human rights offenders, Israel is never the worst human rights offender, but it comes awfully close in the mind of many Europeans and even some young Americans. So BDS is a symptom of that growing demonization of Israel. And it has a perverse effect, because once it becomes a symptom, it becomes in some respects a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you tell a young person at university that Israel is the only country that's being subject to boycott and other sanctions, their immediate response is, it must be the worst. It must be worse than countries that are not subject to the same kinds of incriminatory accusations and sanction regimes. And so it becomes essentially a self-fulfilling prophecy as well. That brings us to short-term versus long-term. In the long term, this can indeed pose a strategic threat to Israel. I'll tell you just an anecdote from my own life that will maybe bring it to some reality. Some of you may know that about 2 years ago I was asked by the Prime Minister of Israel and by the Foreign Minister to become Israel's permanent representative to the United Nations. I could not do that because I'm an American citizen and my primary allegiance is to the United States of America. And I also thought it would not serve well to say that there was nobody in Israel who was qualified to perform that important service. And in fact, Ron Prosser, who got the job, is doing a phenomenal, phenomenal job. But when I told the Prime Minister that I couldn't do it, he said, then I have to ask you to do something else for Israel. And I said, fine, whatever it is, you tell me what I can do as an American. He said, the most important thing that's necessary for Israel's strategic security is a strong American support. Strong American support, both among the Jewish community in the United States, but increasingly among the Christian and other communities in the United States as well. And so I think anything that diminishes American popular support for Israel poses a security threat to Israel. That's not to suggest for a moment that Israel should ever rely on American support. Israel must continue to be, as it has been, self-reliant and independent. It can never outsource its defense to even its greatest ally, the United States of America. Just as the United States would never outsource its defense, Israel could never outsource its defense. It must always remain militarily capable of defending itself. But I think everybody would acknowledge that a significant reduction, a Europeanization of American support for Israel would pose a strategic threat to Israel. That's not happening in the short term. BDS has not succeeded in decreasing support for Israel among Americans. But if you look at the numbers among young kids, kids who are today in high school, kids who are entering college, young people who are graduating college, by the way, it's not so much the case in professional schools. You find almost no support for these movements in law schools, in business schools, in medical schools. You find them largely in the undergraduate schools and in graduate departments of psychology, literature, modern languages, social sciences. You don't find them as much in the hard sciences. It's a very interesting breakdown. But these are our future leaders. When I look at my students in my classes, both college and law students, I don't just see faces like your faces. I see sitting over there the future President of the United States, because the President of the United States did sit there at one time. I see the future Chief Justice, because the future Chief Justice did sit there. I see the executive editor of the New York Times, because, yes, he or she sat there. You see the future leaders, and when these future leaders are being influenced by the DBS movement, you have to project forward and ask yourself whether it will pose a strategic threat in the future. And my answer is it will, unless something is done about it, and we will have opportunity to talk about how to deal with it. Right now we're in the diagnosis phase, not in the treatment phase. And so, finally, I want to talk about the effects not on Israel, but on the world and on the peace process. I think the greatest negative impact that the boycott, divestment, sanction movement has is on the peace process. I think what it does is it disincentivizes the Palestinians to aggressively seek peace now. I think it sends a powerful message to the Palestinian leadership, and this has been conveyed to me personally by 2 Palestinian leaders at the very, very top. We can get a better deal if the divestment, boycott, sanction movement catches on and increases in its power and authority. There is no reason for us to take a deal we don't accept as satisfactory today if every indication is that we will be getting a better deal in the future as the BDS movement gets teeth and sanctions begin to have an impact. Look, we believe sanctions have an impact. We believe that when we're dealing with Iran. Obviously, the sanction that we have in Iran are state-sponsored sanctions, as distinguished from private sanctions. But of course, in Europe, we're moving towards state sanctions as well, particularly on the West Bank. And so, I do think it has a very, very substantial impact currently on the peace process, negative impact. And finally, it has a peace process on the way the world perceives human rights. I think that the singling out of Israel for divestment, boycott, and sanction gives the world an excuse to turn away from the far, far greater human rights problems that exist in so many parts of the world. So, for example, when we saw Rwanda and Darfur and what we're seeing in Syria now, nobody is talking about DBS in those contexts. The focus is still on Israel. It's very hard to get an event sponsored at a university today directed at some of the real problems of the world. But if you mention DBS, you mention Israel, you mention the Palestinians, you can get hundreds, thousands of people to come out and participate in these kinds of protest events. So it has a very negative impact on bringing about prioritization of wrongs in the world and focusing the world's attention on the real problems. Now, if Israel deserved to be singled out for sanctions, that wouldn't be a good enough reason. And I'm sure we'll have time during the discussion to consider the moral implications as well of the DBS movement. But for me, it's an immoral movement. It's a movement that ought to be universally condemned. It's a movement that has taken the moral high ground, unfortunately, from Israel, and it's a movement against which all good people who care about peace and who care about human rights, all good people should oppose this particular effort to delegitimize and to demonize Israel. Thank you.